Hi, welcome back to Super Sons. Today I'm joined by Zac Thompson. Zac has written for Marvel, Boom, Vault, Aftershock, and Black Mask. He was the co-architect for the Age of X-Men at Marvel. He's currently wrapping up Undone by Blood with Lonnie Nadler at Aftershock. His newest book, Lonely Receiver, comes out on September 2nd from Aftershock Comics, and he's taking over the helms of Angel on September 23rd at Boom. Whew, that was a good one. Zac, how are you?
I'm very good. Thank you for having me. I'm really excited to chat today.
I'm very, very excited you're here. I just got to read the first 3 issues of Lonely Receiver, and let me tell you what, they're a lot. Yeah. I got a lot of feelings, and I really hope people pick it up because it is something very special. Like, it's unlike anything I've ever gotten the chance to read before.
Well, thank you.
So, as our listeners know, and you are soon to find out, we are known for our hard-hitting journalism. Like, we're very in-depth, and people are like, oh, these questions, they're really raking us across the coals. So, first up, what's your favorite sandwich?
Currently, this is probably going to be like super boring, but I like tempeh in like a bagel with vegan mayo, hot sauce, and vegan cheese. I'm super boring because I'm a vegan, but tempeh is like this like nut-based protein supplement kind of thing. It's basically like tofu, but more nutty, and I love it too much.
Yeah, I'll be honest with you, that's not boring at all because I've never heard that before. We've only had one vegan on, and his was vegan grilled cheese, so that one also very interesting. I kind of dig tofu. Does it have the same like texture?
No, it's kind of like, it almost is like tofu if it was made of like a bunch of nuts like pressed together, and it can be pretty soft, but because it's like fermented. But if you like grill it up with like a little bit like sesame oil, it is amazing. It gets really crispy. You can kind of almost turn it into bacon.
Huh. All right. Well, I'm just going to have to find it and try this because that kind of sounds awesome.
It's really great.
Yeah. That, you know what? That is a unique sandwich. So don't ever sell yourself short as boring.
All right, great.
So I'm very excited about this one because we get to talk about horror a little bit because a lot of your books have themes of that. So with Lonely Receiver, most people don't really expect to go into a comic book shop to pick up a book that's a deeply emotional, romantic horror story. What made you want to marry those genres?
I think that there's a long history of like sex and violence that sort of goes together in comics. And I think that like, there's plenty of us have experienced relationships where we've loved someone, but also hated them by the end of the relationship because things have gone sour or whatever. And I really am intrigued in sort of duality in horror, that razor thin line between life and death or love and hate. And I thought it would be really interesting to take some of those themes and look at like a really devastating breakup from a horrific horror lens, but really focus on the emotional fallout that kind of brings a character to a dark place, and we watch them as they keep sort of descending inside of themselves and get further and further away from this like idealized version of the story that we're presenting at the beginning. And also, like, I think that there's not many like romance comics out there. So it's an interesting avenue to explore from that angle because it's one, completely new to me, but two, I'm hoping that I can kind of like show that genres are pretty malleable and you don't really have to be confined to one sort of interpretation of your story. And honestly, I think it makes it more interesting when you don't really know what to expect and you're kind of carried along on that wave with the book.
And yeah, I guess there aren't many romance comics left because I know they were super popular back in the day because you see all those covers kind of like as icons. So you were talking about the medium itself. So why does comics as a medium feel like the right place to explore those like the blending of genres, especially where they intersect?
Yeah, I think it comes down to, because of the visual medium, it's really easy to present your case in a really interesting and compelling way, and that like you can basically, like this is a neon soaked horror book, so it has this like evocative color palette that feels really inviting, but it is also sort of wrapped around like a simmering darkness that sort of slowly reveals itself. And I think that that's super interesting. And both sort of have a history in comics, like old, 3-color palette horror comics that are using like bright primaries to sort of like show horrible murders and that kind of thing. And I really wanted to go back and like look at like what I could bring to horror. Personally, I thought was like something that is a little brighter, that's something that is a little bit more emotional and in line with kind of who I am, because I'm pretty generally like flamboyant and colorful, and I don't always see that in horror, and I love horror. So I think that juxtaposition, when people meet me and they're like, what? Like you've got like a, like a floral, like extremely loud shirt on right now, and you're telling me the story about like disembowelment, and I'm like, yeah, that's me.
Great description. I have an affinity for floral as well. So I'm going to go off script a little bit. What do you think is the most romantic horror film you've ever seen?
Okay, Lonely Receiver came from my obsession with an older film from 1981 called Possession. It is essentially like has this like very lurid reputation within the horror genre, because for a long time it was like part of the video nasty movement, where it was like really difficult to get a good copy that wasn't a bootleg in North America. Mm-hmm. And it's about a man who finds out that his wife is cheating on him with like a Lovecraftian elder god. And you don't really see that until maybe the last act of the film, but I love the idea of that like romance driving him to know more, like who could possibly be better than me. But there's also romance has a long history in like vampire myth, right? Like that sort of desire and that unyielding sort of want to know more, to be more. And I think that like horror occupies that same sort of like titillation that romance does, where you're sort of like teetering on the edge of release, right? Like you want that tension to be relieved. Romance works on building tension and then, releasing it with sex, and horror often works on building tension and releasing it with violence or death. So I thought that duality was really interesting to explore.
So the 1981 Possession, that has Sam Neill, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. I've always seen it because of the whole thing surrounding it, but I've never gotten to see it. So now I'm going to have to go check it out. Yeah. So, as you said, go ahead.
It is, watching it with a 2020 lens, there are parts of it that are problematic. That's what I should say, with a trigger warning as well, because it's not dealing with these things in the way that we would be dealing with them in 2020. Let's just say that.
Yeah, but I mean, if you have a chance to like stoop an elder god, I'd probably take it. I'll be honest with you.
Obviously, yeah.
Like Cthulhu was banging down my door. Like, I'm not going to tell him no. So, are there any like sort of quote unquote masters of the horror genre you take your inspirations from?
Yeah, I mean, like I'm obsessed with David Cronenberg. I mean, you can get maybe 5-6 pages into the comic before those references are very apparent. I really wanted to do something that evoked some of his best work, in my opinion, where he occupies this sort of idea that like certain things in your comics should just be taken as matter of fact, even if they're extremely weird. So in Lonely Receiver, we have phones that are made of flesh. There's a little bit in the back of the first issue that explains how these things work, but it's taken as fact because this is the world that these characters live in. And I really didn't want to get into 20 pages of exposition as to why these things exist and how they work. There is a satisfying answer for where they come from and how they work, but I really didn't want to like front load readers with that information. I'm also obsessed with Clive Barker. I think that duality that I was talking about earlier is something that Clive continued to revisit through his entire body of work. Hellraiser is very much about the razor thin line between love and violence. I'm currently obsessed with Jeff Vandermeer and like eco horror, as it was called, which is sort of probably the largest inspiration on Lonely Receiver because it occupies a space called like weird fiction, where that's sort of also what Lovecraft has sort of been rebranded as, or some of these stories that occupy a space that's just left of reality, where things are just slightly off. But again, the characters who occupy the world don't scratch at that too much. They don't ask too many questions about the odd things. They actually sort of go through very human journeys, but the backdrop is a weird world. And I thought, much like my often co-writer Lonnie Nadler's book, like Black Stars Above, which very much delves into that like cosmic weird fiction, I wanted to do that, but in a completely different way. And I was like, well, if my co-writer is going to the past, I'll go to the future and I'll do something similar but different.
It is funny that is the last comic I read before reading this one. Now with that in mind, I still have half of Black Stars to finish, but I should have like mentally prepared myself to read both of those books, because they're so beautiful in the fact that they're exploring horror from a different lens than what I'm used to, because I'm a big slasher fan, and having the horror be, I mean, most horror makes you question yourself and like the ideas, but having ones where I can't look at my phone the same are very different. So you did touch upon like your craft and how you're writing these comics. So I do have a couple questions about that. As you mentioned, you do work with Lonnie pretty often. And what is it like for you to co-write a book rather than coming at something by yourself? Not by yourself, but with a team of you as the writer.
Yeah, so co-writing is always an interesting process because it a lot of it comes down to almost like having your editor in the room with you. Lonnie and I have sort of grown as writers together because our approach was probably different than most co-writers in that we would like sit in the same room, like literally my living room or his living room, with our laptops open and sort of just talking about what we loved and what stories interested us and how we could sort of like explore some of those themes. And then that got to a place where like we're literally writing in the same document side by side, as we sort of come up with these scripts, and like someone writes a line of dialogue, the other person's like, oh, maybe that doesn't work. And we sort of workshop it on the fly. Whereas, working by yourself, you're isolated, you're by yourself, you're sort of coming up with all of these ideas, and then you're sort of like pitching it to your friends whenever you can, being like, is this crazy? Does this work? Comics are inherently collaborative. And I think that one of the nice things about starting my career in that co-writing space was that it taught me that my ideas are not scripture. They're not perfect. They're often half-formed, and they need scrutiny and they need further exploration. And when you work with a co-writer, you can really hone in on what's working about the ideas that you've presented and what's not. And similarly, writing No One's Rose with Emily, she brought to that book a really incredible knowledge of climate science and science fiction. She comes from a more like prose background and just finished her master's of publishing. And so it was really interesting to approach that book from a different perspective because her and I collaborated on No One's Rose a little bit differently than Lonnie and I collaborate on like Undone by Blood or anything like that. And so it was just interesting because now I feel like I've worked on multiple projects with other people, and I've been able to sort of like step outside of my own perspective and see what other people add to my writing, but also figure out where I want to be as an individual writer too, which is incredibly valuable. I would recommend to anyone who's doing like creative writing to try and co-write something with someone, because one, it's not easy, but two, it really teaches you sort of where your blind spots are. By hook or by crook, you sort of find out because the other person's like, hey, wait a second, that doesn't make any sense. And you're like, yes, it does. And then you're like, oh, wait, no, you're right. It doesn't.
And it gives you the ebb and flow of like, this is your pieces and this is their pieces, but them being together is collaborative in the form of this art and all those types of things. That's very interesting. So with No One's Rose and Lonely Receiver both being independent books, is there a way you approached co-writing at Marvel different than you did with these? Did you feel more freedom, or what was it like?
I mean, there's always less freedom when you're working on properties that belong to other people, that belong to corporations on top of that. Those rules sort of make writing easier and more difficult in different ways. I think more often than not, having those confines keeps your story kind of like able to live and breathe on very limited terms, but it allows you to get innovative with solutions to problems. The reverse is sort of true in creator-owned books, where no one's telling you how far to go. No one's telling you you can't do that, you can't do this. So you're kind of given an opportunity to sort of fully develop a book in whatever way you want, but you can also go off the rails really easily and get really caught up in detail work or stuff that may not even end up making its way into the book. And so I think the nice thing is after doing both, I've kind of learned that there's like a good marriage between the two, but also, the easiest way that I always explain it to people is like writing at Marvel is like a sprint, and writing a creator-owned book is like a marathon. You can only do your best in the sprint, and you're going to be exhausted afterwards, and you'll look back and you'll go like, oh shit, like maybe I could have done a couple things differently. But like with your creator-owned books, if you pace yourself and you give yourself enough runway and you give yourself enough time to figure it out, you can really create something incredible and achieve something incredible. But it all comes down to making sure that you're not spreading yourself too thin.
Wow. Sorry, I'm a little bit taken, but like that is such a great answer. And especially what you're saying, like the sprint and the marathon. It is interesting how someone like you, who has done a lot of creator-owned independent work, wrote a huge event with Age of X-Men, and I'm trying to think of the best way to say this, but it felt like an independent event rather than a Marvel event in like such a unique and interesting concept. So I got to give it to you. That was incredible.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, Lonnie and I intended to make the anti-event.
Yeah. It blew my mind, especially someone who's not, I don't love event comics. And then I read all of it and I was like, wow, holy shit. How did they get away with this?
We were asking ourselves the same question every day.
Yeah. And so I wanted to get a little bit more insight on the like actual creation of Lonely Receiver itself. After reading those 3 issues, they're not here. I just wanted to say the art by Jen Hickman is just incredible. The attention to color in reference to sort of like states of depression and mental positioning, it was better than any comic I've ever seen it done in. And Simon Boland's lettering for the first 3 issues was an absolute pleasure to read because it was spectacular. So when you're crafting the pitch for a story like this, do you start with a particular artist in mind? Or do you work with an artist?
So with Lonely Receiver, it was a concept that I brought to Aftershock. When was it? It was pretty much right after I finished The Replacer. And I was like, hey, I want to do a crazy like romance book, but it's sort of an intersection with horror. And they were like, that's insane. Like, we don't really see how that would work. If you can like map it out and show us sort of like what the full story would be, then maybe we'll be on board. And so I mapped it out. And as I was doing that, the sort of like candy colored sort of approach became apparent to me. One, because I was sort of thinking about how I could bring something to a book that maybe someone else couldn't, in that like I'm obsessed with color. I'm obsessed with neon. I really love that sort of color scheme in film, and felt like there was an opportunity to play with that duality, as you mentioned. And then once the final story was approved, I started looking for people that could be that sort of versatile style and actually, like occupy both a colorist and an artist role, which, is not that list is pretty small. So I reached out to Jen and we started talking, and almost instantly they picked up what I was putting down. They were completely on board and sort of understood the reference points and understood sort of what I was trying to achieve. And honestly, like, it's one of the best collaborations I've had in comics, because we sort of seem to be occupying the same like wavelength, and like we had a really great shorthand towards the end of the book where it was just like they understood what I was trying to do in the script and completely nailed it every time. And there was always a lot of like back and forth about how to achieve duality and everything, right? Like, the making some of this feel like the emotions are dark and horrible, but the colors are beautiful and evocative of like someone kind of hiding from the reality that they're experiencing. And so, yeah, Jen just came on and, right at the beginning was like, I have a vision for this. I have exactly sort of what I want to do. And they whipped together the first issue, and it was perfect. Like, it was one of the few times where, first of all, they do everything super quick and efficiently. And like, I'm a very organized person just in general, so it was great in that respect. But seeing the entire issue presented in front of me, and I had almost no notes, it was quite cool. It was just like, oh shit, like you took exactly what I was thinking and made it happen. Fuck yeah, this is going to be sick. And then we just ran with it.
Yeah, I was blown away by their art. Just, it matches the tone so well and like explores it in a different way that I just wasn't expecting in a comic. So, as you said, you're working sort of hand in hand with them on this, but normally when you do a book, do you develop the style of your worlds with an artist, or do you have something in mind when you come to it and then you tell the artist and they run with it?
It's a little, it's usually an organic process that sort of like is pretty fluid, but like for No One's Rose in particular, Emily and I had done a ton of world building and sort of like had drawn up some documents about some maps and some things about how this world would work, and some different outfits and clothings and sort of like different symbology for the caste system within the dome. And we sent that all off to Alberto, and Alberto basically took that all, digested it, and then created the entire look for the book. And so like, I find that that's usually the approach. And I've actually sort of like recalibrated my approach since, because that process with Alberto was so good that now I sort of do all of that world building that I can, but I present sort of a huge document to people from the beginning, and I go like, here's sort of what I'm thinking. You can obviously change whatever you want, but it's just like, this is my best approximation of everything that I could think of. And like, I try really hard to, like for Lonely Receiver in particular, because I knew the phones were going to be weird and they were going to be made of flesh and like kind of open up like a makeup compact. I sent that early to Jen, and I said like, here's what I'm thinking. I know it's crazy, but like, these things should probably be designed and we should figure them out beforehand, so we don't have to like make it up on the fly on the page. And I've become a pretty big proponent for like not designing anything on the page, mostly just because that's where you get inconsistencies and that kind of thing. And so, working everything out that you could possibly do before you even start issue 1, so you're not having any surprises prop up, I think is hugely important to me. And it comes from, I think because I went to film school and I'm very sort of like process oriented, I really like to sort of give artists like a large amount of information. They don't have to use all of it, but it's just like, here's what's inside my brain. And it's sort of like a big data dump. I'm working on something new that also has like weird technology in it. And I'm working with the artist back and forth to develop it because they had read the script and they were like, oh shit, like this is going to take some design work. And I was like, yeah, here you go. Here's what I'm thinking. And we went back and forth and we came up with something really, really cool that I'm excited for people to see. It's going to be a while away, but I'm now realizing that world design is just as important as character design. And if you're not thinking about that kind of stuff, your world can kind of feel inconsistent.
Sorry, we just had to let my cat into the office because she was screaming at the door.
Oh, no worries. I know that pain all too well.
Yeah, she's pretty good during interviews, but she has to be in the room with me. So we did touch on sort of, you mentioned you didn't want to front load with these comics, and you have information pages in No One's Rose with the explanation of the sort of dome itself. And in Lonely Receiver, you mentioned the phone ad in the end of the first issue. Do you think these things are helpful for your storytelling? So it gives more of a snapshot of the world rather than having to take up the first few pages to explain that? While in these issues, you actually had the first 3 pages be just like fantastic hooks to get people into the story.
So I think that like my process is basically like get people's boots on the ground as fast as humanly possible, throw them into the world, let them sort of absorb some of what's going on, and, let them have questions rather than just answering everything up front. I think if you lead with questions, that compels people to read going forward. But also, I think there's a really interesting opportunity with comics to be more playful in the way that they present text and the way that they present information. It's no secret that Jonathan Hickman, what he's doing on the X-Men with data pages and stuff, is really fascinating, at least to me as a writer, because I think that blend of putting prose in with comics and letting them sort of have this intertextuality is something that you can only do in comics. So why not lean into it? Why not have some fun with it? Because it also, like, for me, I think you can create like quote unquote like primary documents from the world, which is very much what is in the back of Lonely Receiver, and allow people to sort of feel like they have a better understanding of what this phone is, because now you've seen the character use it, interact with it, but on top of that, now you see how the company is branding it and telling you what it is, and those two things don't perfectly match up, and so the truth is somewhere in the middle. And I think that like too often, in my opinion, comics or film or whatever give you very concrete explanations of very complicated things. And if that happens too quickly, I personally just get overwhelmed and I'm like, oh, I don't I'm just like, that doesn't sit right with me. And then I'm thinking more about that than I am about the story.
And with the phone itself, it's such an interesting, I don't want to spoil anything, but it's so, the symbiotic relationship between a person and their cellular device as it is now is very much highlighted in this for me. I don't know if that was your intention, but the phone is creepy. I'll admit that, but it is creepy in a way that makes you think of how we treat our phones as something sentient. With that, I did want to get into the themes of Lonely Receiver a little bit without any spoilers. So the story seems to be examining our connection somewhat to technology and how it connects us as people. Do you feel that in this age of instant communication that we're sort of deprived of the ability to feel comfortable being by ourselves at times.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I feel like, one of the great myths of social media is that it brings people closer together. But I don't know if you've ever, I can remember vividly when I was younger, maybe in my early 20s, when social media was becoming a thing, and by looking at it, feeling more alone than I had ever without it. And I think just by virtue of seeing all these different experiences that I wasn't party to, or that I wasn't invited to, or whatever, just sort of made me become more aware of my own loneliness. And I think that there are plenty of benefits to online social media and online, interactions. I'm very well aware that now, living through this pandemic, there's a lot of stuff that I've been doing online that I wouldn't have done a couple months ago, like watching movies over Discord with friends just because we can't get together or whatever. And that's amazing. But I think that as this book is dealing with social media or relationships to digital devices, I want to show that, in my opinion, if you give yourself too much of yourself to your device, you can lose yourself in service of some version that you're sort of presenting. If you're too invested in your social media, you're too invested in this projection of yourself rather than the reality of your life, rather than the reality of what's actually around you and close to you. And we are slipping further and further into thinking that online validation equals you're right, or that you are worth listening to, or that you are intelligent or successful or whatever. And those things can be true, but I think oftentimes, especially now, we are reinforcing this cult of personality that leaves a lot of people behind. And that's something that this book is trying to examine, is that if you give yourself too much of yourself to these things and you don't think about the world around you, or you don't take care of your friendships or your relationships, what do you do if that goes away? What happens if, you no longer you're kicked off of Twitter? I don't know why you would be, but I just mean what happens if you define your life by this thing and then that's suddenly removed? You have to really take a hard look at yourself and go who am I without this?
It's sort of that hollow validation that is being explored more in film and television. I want to say Black Mirror, but I'm actually thinking of the Meow Meow Beans episode of Community. If you've seen that.
Yeah.
I think of that as a social validation, that you're getting these points from this social interaction online that sometimes isn't. I don't want to. I hate calling things hollow, but it isn't a. There's no hand-in-hand connection. You're not making a real connection with someone, and that sort of leads into what I want to get into a little bit deeper, is that with this age of communication, is it easy to have too much? And it made me think about, we interviewed Tim Seeley quite a while ago, and he was talking about Twitter, and he brought up Dunbar's number. So what Dunbar's number is it the theory that a mind can only maintain 150 connections at once, and after that it starts to lose empathy. Do you find in the age of instant connection and Twitter and all the social medias and stuff that it's sort of too easy to communicate with a mass of people, and it sort of blurs the lines of connection itself, where you think there is a connection, but it's not, it's too vague to be there?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? Because part of this is bringing us closer to a ton of people, but for example, I've experienced this in sort of real time, where my comic book career, I've only been doing this for about 3.5 years. And after year 2, we were heading a Marvel event. And that's a degrees of difference in terms of how many people are reaching out to do interviews and sort of just are interested in your work all of a sudden. And then you add the complexity of the X-Men onto it, and that's a very rampant fandom that can skin you alive if you don't, if you know, like, and it can be like as innocuous as like, I like, Gene and Logan together, and people are like, blasphemy, fuck you. And
yes, it's very, very hostile with that certain character.
And so you have this moment where your connections to people are increasing exponentially and very, very quickly. And the amount of people reaching out are suddenly, maybe when it was 10 people before when you were doing indie comics, it's now 200. And so you start to sort of lose yourself in that process because you're like, you'll see people who you've never talked to message you like they're your best friend. You'll see people who you've never met tell you that they want you to die. And it's a weird thing because your self-worth gets wrapped up in that, even if you know you shouldn't. And I think with something like this, we would like to be best friends with everyone. We would like to connect with more and more and more and more people. And we are validated by higher numbers of followers, interactions, that kind of thing. But, I think that if you get too caught up in that, you start to lose sight of what is actually real and what is true about yourself. I don't think anyone is under the impression that someone's Twitter profile is a 1-to-1 representation of who they are. Right. Like there's a degree of performance involved to anything that exists online because, like I will have rough days, but I don't genuinely like go online and be like, I'm having a real rough mental health day. Woe is me, because I also realize that like I'm in a place of privilege. I do a really cool job. I have a lot to be very happy for, and I don't always want to put that out on blast when I'm having a hard time or whatever, because I don't want people who maybe have a very fleeting connection with me react negatively to that information. But I also don't want to invite people who may feel like they do know me to talk to me about my mental health. And that's a strange line that you have to draw. And you can lose yourself to it. I think there are people who lose themselves to this infinite sea of connection, and sort of like you can see it happen in real time sometimes where someone's like ego gets wrapped up too much in what they're doing. And then you kind of go like, well, is your life just social media, or is there something more to it? I'm utterly fascinated with influencers, people who just exist in order to basically sell products, and they're very, very popular for some reason. And there's always this air of like, you're part of their family or part of their like sort of little in group if you're supporting them. And if you're not, then they're just like, fuck you, ride or die. And they sort of disconnect from that relationship. And like, I don't know, it's really hard to find clear boundaries for yourself in that instant interaction social media world. And I think that this book is so much about how do you define yourself outside of your online life? How do you sort of reclaim the parts of yourself that you lost? And how do we tell ourselves narratives via social media about ourselves? There's so much myth making and storytelling that people do about their own personality that if you're not taking stock of that every once in a while, you can lose yourself to it.
And you sort of become this, your character on these platforms where you're interacting with people as this identity you've built through the validation of the connection. Dang, that's some real shit right there. So that's probably the heaviest answer we've ever gotten on Super Sons. So let me follow it up. Let me follow that up with who's the best Buffyverse character and why is it Lorne?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in full agreement there. I love the idea of a demon who has to get you to perform karaoke in order to like bare your soul. And there's just something, he's also just amazing, right? Andy Halley, or is it Andy? Always forget the name of the actor. Andy Hallett, who unfortunately passed away like 11 years ago. He was just like, there's something kinetic about his energy on screen all the time, and I just adore him. I'm working him into the second arc of Angel right now, and I think that, like, I always saw clips of Angel before I had started watching it, and I was like, who is this weird demon dude who like is wearing the flashy suits and with the little horns?
Like his yellow suit. He's so good.
Yeah, and he represents that LA culture perfectly. And I think that he really comes into his own in later seasons, where he's basically, there's an episode in season 5 where he's like hosting a party, and he's becoming like more and more demonic as
the Halloween party.
Yeah.
Oh, he becomes like this Hulk-like monster.
Yes, I love it. I just love it. Yeah.
And I think so, and spoilers for a show that ended over 10 years ago.
Yeah.
The Let's Go to Work ending didn't hurt me as much as Lorne having to cross that line to take a life, and he goes, that's all, folks, and then that's it. He doesn't show up for the final battle.
I love that
character who was so big and charismatic, and like he had all these things, and it ends on such a whimper because of the war he got kind of drug into.
Yeah, I think that it speaks to the humanity of those shows too, and why people are drawn to them. But like that really interesting, like he's basically puffing up his chest all the time, and you think like, oh yeah, he'd have no problem with this. And then when it actually comes to the moment, you feel that pain. And I just think his arc is one of the best handled on that show by a country mile.
Yes, absolutely. And this final question is normally Jake's question. But if you had to construct a Rube Goldberg machine, what would its end function be?
I would love to be able to just like basically like flick a domino from my bedside table and then start a Rube Goldberg that would just make coffee for me. So I could just go downstairs and have it perfectly ready, and perhaps somehow keep this mechanism moving so it would always keep it hot. I don't know how. It sounds extremely dangerous, but it'd
be worth it in the end.
Exactly.
Your house would be a mess, but like it would be worth it.
Just a sea of hot coffee all over the floor every day.
At least you get to drink it. It's just you have to drink it off the floor.
Perfect. Yeah.
So I'm very thankful you came on to join me. Your book comes out on September 2nd, and you'll be taking over Angel later that month. Is there anything else you wanted to chat about?
No,
any other topics?
I'm just thankful to be on the show and to be given the spotlight to talk about this. This is a book that is very weird and I think is very beautiful, but it will be interesting to see what sort of audience we find, because it's definitely not the normal type of comic you would get on the shelf.
Yeah, it's not Batman, but it has so much to say, and I really hope it finds its audience proper. So where can people find you online? Where can we connect with you?
You can form a vapid connection with me on Twitter. My username there is Zac B.E. Thompson, and you can also find me on Instagram under the same name. I will say that I try to pride myself on talking to people on social media, and one of the things that I find really important and valuable about social media is that it is an outlet to help younger creators or people who are involved in this community find kinship with one another. And I'd be remiss if I didn't say that the comic book community as it exists online is incredibly supportive, and I'm very, very happy to be part of it. And if there's anyone listening that ever wants to run a comic book idea by someone who's been doing this for a little while, or, just want some feedback or some words of encouragement, my DMs are open and I will always respond. It might take me a few days, but I will I will see you and I will respond to you.
That is the nicest thing I've probably ever heard. So that means a whole lot, because as I've told you, our mission is to help people who feel that comics are inaccessible or unapproachable and kind of tear down those walls to help them get in. So knowing that creators feel the same way is always reassuring to me. So you can find us at DC Super Sons on Twitter, on Instagram, and all those other places. We will be back in 2 weeks. Catch us same bat time, same bat channel.